Hello to everybody joining this exclusive briefing for Haaretz subscribers. Today's briefing is one of a series of briefings with Haaretz's top experts. Our next briefing will actually be in February, and if you have any requests for topics or journalists you'd like to meet or hear from, please let us know. And thank you for everyone who has sent in questions ahead of this briefing, as we asked. You sent in nearly 1,000 questions from all over the world. Because there are so many of them, I've tried to weave them in to the main body of the questions that I will ask our panelists. But towards the second half of this briefing, we will be taking some of the questions that you asked during this briefing. Send them to the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we will try to deal with them. This briefing will be recorded and the full video will be shared with subscribers in the coming days. Now, to start, welcome first of all to our three panelists, Sheren Falah Saab, Haaretz's Arab World Cultural Affairs correspondent, to Dahlia Scheindlin, political analyst and author of a new book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, and of course, Haaretz columnist, and Hauser-Tov, Haaretz's chief political correspondent. Now, to you, first of all, the panelists, I will be directing specific questions at you, but please feel free to jump in if you want to add your voice to some of the questions that you hear that I'm asking anyone else. Straight on to the topic, Israel, Gaza, and the charge of genocide. There was something like an audible gasp around the world when South Africa announced it would be petitioning the International Court of Justice in The Hague, accusing Israel of violating the UN Convention Against Genocide in its military actions in Gaza, in the behavior of its public officials, and in the intent of its policies and rhetoric. The case has triggered a deluge of responses and commentary, from support and encouragement to accusations of anti-Semitism. The court could take years to investigate the case and deliver its judgment, but last Friday, the court gave a ruling, an interim ruling, in response to South Africa's request for an emergency intervention, most clearly a request for an immediate ceasefire. This was denied. Michael, if I can start with you. Although anyone can use the term genocide as a rhetorical or descriptive term, it has a very specific legal definition. Can you describe the legal definition of genocide and what distinguishes it from crimes against humanity and war?
So thank you, Esther. As you said, the specific act of genocide is completely different from any other war crime that can be discussed on the ICJ, on the International Court of Justice. This specific crime of genocide is one of the hardest cases that can be rolled in the court, and in particular about this case and this war that just started a few months ago. But the question, I was sent to the Hague from Haaretz to cover the court discussions, and the question that was on the table is not if or if not Israel made any genocide in Gaza Strip, is the question of the plausible situation of genocide. And this is something completely different, and the main clearance between those two differences have to be very clear to all our audience. At the end of the day, the South Africans and the Palestinians, which are combined together in this case, will try to accuse Israel in genocide. And for that, they will have to prove few things. The first of all is the wanted of genocide actions. Mainly, this is the most difficult part of the case because no other country that wants to do genocide says loudly, "I'm gonna kill this particular group." In Israel case, this was very, very different because of the behavior of the Israeli politicians, because all what you heard all those months from Israel starts with President Herzog and Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Gallant and Minister of Foreign Affairs Katz, and of course Eyal Golan, which is a very famous songer in Israel, or some soldiers that took videos of them calling some calls against the Palestinians and against the Gaza Strip citizens. The South African used those sentence against Israel, and one of the most difficult part of this case to try to show the court the wanted of doing a genocide crime became much more easier. Although this is not a meaning, of course, of the state of Israel, and this is what the legal team of Israel tried to present during all those cases, which probably get accepted by the court. The second part that the South African needed to show at court is the plausible situation of doing a genocide crime. And then they used all the strike that's being done by Israel during the last few months and the last few weeks to try to show that this is the Israeli plausible activities, and this can be made. These two parts of the case are very, very, very difficult and very different from any other crime against humanity or war crime that can be made by any country. The South African decided to go for this specific accuse, and this will be a very big question if something will be able to prove from this case and to rule against Israel during the next few months and years, because the crime of genocide will gonna need years to be cleared at the ICJ.
So you just discussed about the centrality of proving there is intent to genocide and that there must be plausible grounds to bring the case. Now, in this preliminary ruling that was given last week, did you find, what did they actually rule at that point? I mean, they did not rule for a ceasefire, which is what South Africa had asked for, but were there other aspects of it that they did uphold? And perhaps more broadly, you know, does it indicate anything, this interim ruling, does it indicate anything about where the court's thinking is going?
So first of all, South Africa asks a lot of acts. The stop of war, the ceasefire, was just one act that South Africa asked at the case, but there was something like 10 or I think even a little bit more, sorry, I can't remember the exact number of acts that the South African asked. So this specific act wasn't given by the court, and another very important act, which is to let the civilian population of north of Gaza to come back to their house. This act wasn't accepted by court as well. So those were the two main acts that's denied by the court, and the court let Israel continue with the war, and the court let Israel continue to hold the north of Gaza without any civilian population. I don't believe that we are able to learn anything about court decision about the main question: does or does not Israel made a crime of genocide in Gaza Strip? And this will be very, very unofficially to try to answer this question, because this is really a years situation, and a case that can be ruling for years by the court. So it's really just the beginning. It's not even the beginning. It's the pre-ruling of all this case. So we really cannot presume anything about the judges, and we will have to wait and see.
Okay, well, jumping off from that, Dahlia, even though, as Michal said, you can't necessarily know anything about where the case is going to go, nonetheless, both sides, South Africa and Israel, both jumped on this decision to claim it as a victory for each of their sides in some ways. Can you explain why that would be the case?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you to everybody for attending. I mean, for one thing, I think we need to maybe lean in the term happy. You know, South Africa certainly is to some extent satisfied in the sense that the court, first of all, accepted the jurisdiction, accepted the idea that as a third party, South Africa can bring this case, which is something that is a more recent precedent for the ICJ, and also that, of course, the court admitted the plausibility that there is a violation of the right to protection of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. So that, of course, will go on to the merit stage. But they were also at least somewhat satisfied with the provisional measures that the court did order. And you know, as Michal pointed out, they didn't get their full request. And the court even said, we are not under obligation to issue orders that are exactly identical to what was requested. But the orders that they did request was that Israel, A, make sure that it does not conduct the war in a way that threatens Palestinians for the protection of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention or threaten to commit genocide, which some legal scholars have pointed out is a clear signal, but also something that essentially every country that's party to the Genocide Convention would have to do. And of course, the court ordered Israel to investigate and punish anybody who incites to genocide, as well as the critical issue of providing humanitarian aid for civilians and letting that aid get through and reporting on that, asking that Israel provide a report within a month. So those are the kinds of things that I think South Africa, again, first of all, accepting the jurisdiction, accepting the case in general, and ordering those initial things is somewhat of, it's a partial advantage. Victory, I think, is the wrong term, but it's partially what South Africa wanted. In terms of Israel, let me make the point a little more strongly. Israel is not happy at all. Israel might have been on some level relieved, of course, that the court didn't order, an immediate cessation of the fighting or suspension of the fighting. That, just to remind people, would have led to a very dramatic political and legal saga in which, based on if the court had issued an order for a suspension of fighting, this might have become the basis for a debate in the Security Council and a resolution in the Security Council that would have gone through, it would become a global issue. The US would have vetoed it. I think it would have been, an ongoing global drama. And frankly, such a ruling itself, I can't help but thinking about the counterfactual. If the court had actually ruled that Israel must cease the fighting, suspend the fighting right away, I think it would have been the final break between Israel and the international courts and Israel and the entire international system. Israel, you have to realize, let's just ground people in the Israeli discourse right now. The vast majority of Israelis from the leadership downward believe that the entire international system and the concept of international law was essentially somehow constructed as an anti-Israel mechanism. Which is sad, but that is very often how it's discussed in very mainstream conversations and in the media. And so I think that if there is some relief at the judgment, I think it's in a way important because there would have been no legitimacy left for the courts in Israel. And that would have, set in motion a process that I think would have led to a fundamental break in the legitimacy and credibility of the international court, before other global actors. So in that sense, Israel is sort of relieved, but there is a great concern about the ongoing case in the future that will be decided on its merits in the language of the court about whether there is genocide or not. And I think, for many Israelis, just the sense that just the fact that this case was heard at all, and that the court ruled in any way that Israel has to do anything. You need to understand the default position is to reject that as an anti-Israel and anti-Semitic initiative effort. I think it's important to orient people in the starting point of how Israeli society is looking at this. And of course, let me make it clear, when I say that, I'm characterizing primarily Jewish Israeli society. I don't think Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel see it that way.
Okay, Michael, if you just go back to you before moving to you, Sheren, when you were in The Hague and you were listening to the hearings, can you give some kind of sense of what the atmosphere was like? What were the arguments or the moments that most stood out for you and you think that will really carry on as the court deliberates? And perhaps in a more general way, how strong did you assess South Africa's case to be and how strong Israel's defense was?
I think that South African case might have been much stronger if they were decided to go for another crimes of war or crimes against humanity and not specifically the act of genocide. I truly believe, first of all, because I'm an Israeli and I'm not what's happening here. But secondly, from hearing both sides of the court, South Africa and Israel, that the specific case of genocide is very, very weak case. I can't believe that South Africa will have enough efforts to prove that Israel has been made a genocide. I can't see how exactly they can go on with this case, and how would it like when the court asks specific questions about the crime of genocide and not only the plausible of crime of genocide. If South Africa will go with any other war crimes or crimes against humanity even, maybe the picture would look a little bit different. But this specific case, I think that is more a PR case. I think that South African already got their gold, and this is all the international debate about Israel genocide and Israel strong acts against Palestinians, and the work of the South Africa, the job of South Africa already done. Now, in the rule of justice inside the court, I think it's going to be almost impossible to go on with this case and prove such a crime of genocide.
Okay, I'm sure that Dahlia would have a response to that, but I do want to move on to Sheren to bring in the other party that was not represented in the court itself, and that is the people of Gaza themselves. You've been in contact with Gazans since the start of the war. You've been writing about their first-hand experiences of dislocation, of death, and of hunger. I just want to quote from one of your recent articles when you were giving testimonies from Gazans who are now in tent cities. Tent cities makes it sound more organized and pleasant, perhaps, than the kind of desperate tents that they're setting up for themselves. And several of them said to you, if death doesn't come in an airstrike, hunger will bring it. Can you explain how extreme conditions are right now for people in Gaza? And a kind of impossible question, but do you get the sense that they would back the charge of genocide that is being discussed at the ICJ?
Okay, first of all, I should say that Gaza right now is a place that is impossible to live there. Gazans have lack everything you can think about it. They lack there is lack of warm clothes, food, safe space, medicine, shampoo, televisions, hygiene products, toilet paper. Even going to the bathroom, people have to wait at least and 1 hour. There are lack of clean water, blankets, games for children. So this is the situation where the basic conditions for living is not exist, and it's a huge harm for Gazans as a human being. So this is the start point. And, you know, Esther, we are sitting now talking with each other in Zoom conversation. People are listening to our conversation, feel safe enough and asking questions. But, you know, I have friends now sitting in Rafah in tents, and they're very, very worried about the weather, and if the water will drip from the tents, and what they have to do during this extreme conditions, and if they will have receive enough help and humanitarian aid. So it's a very sad moment for me as a journalist who is talking to Gazans people every day. And there's sometimes moments that when I'm talking to Gazan people, I just cry, because it's unimaginable situation and suffering. And sometimes it reminds me the suffering of Syrian refugees during the war in Syria. You know, the war right now is changing the lives of Gazans in extreme ways. And there are also people write their diaries and documenting their lives, trying to publish for the whole world in English and in Arabic. And the dominant feature is the fear. The fear is very exists. People are very afraid to die, afraid to lose their relatives during the war, and afraid to not return to their homes. So they really lost the meaning of life. You know, I talked today earlier to my friend from Gaza. She's from Gaza City, and she displaced to Rafah. She now lives in a tent with her family. She has 3 children, and she told me that little boy is sick. By the way, he's the age of my little daughter also. So we are sharing the motherhood. And she told me that he's sick and he has a fever and there's no medicine, and she's very afraid that there's no medical help and there's no medicine, and she was very afraid and worried that the situation will get worse. And I'm asking myself what we can do right now. We can talk hours about genocide, not genocide, but there's people that's suffering right now. And when I ask some friends what they think about the definition of genocide or the International Human Rights Court, so I think the important point is the suffering here, and they're very disappointed that until now there's no clear calling for ceasefire, and the world's still watching, and there's great anger and disappointment that the war still continue while we're talking right now. And the decision of the International Court that there's no clear calling for a ceasefire. And all of these circumstances and conditions, they feel very frustrated and disappointed.
Do they feel that this is, you know, obviously Gazans over the age of not that old at all have already experienced other conflicts with Israel and other wars. Is there a feeling that this is the intent of the war this time is different, or it's just a far worse war? No,
it's a very different war. You know, people lost everything, their work, their life, their homes. People have to evacuate from the north of Gaza to the south, and they don't know what will happen the day after the war. You know, they are not the unknowing situation, that you don't know what will go back and if they will return to their homes or not. This is a very unconfident about what will happen to their families, and we see also a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of all the aspects of life. People lost their jobs. There's no agriculture. The crisis of the also medical system, educational system. There's nothing normal in Gaza right now. It's very different and extreme situation of living.
Thank you for that very, very important understanding or window into what is happening now in Gaza. Dahlia, I want to just go back to you for a minute. Many readers have asked, remembering that this war started with October the 7th, bearing in mind the actions of Hamas on that day, the murder, the rape, the mutilation of bodies, the hostage taking, the massive rocket fire at civilian targets. And if you take Hamas's ideological commitment to destroy Israel, and subsequent comments by Hamas officials that they would do October the 7th again and again, why are they not appearing in any international court of any kind? Aren't their actions closer to the definition of genocide? And is there in fact any mechanism in international law to prosecute them?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's worth pointing out that in the ICJ's decision in the International Court of Justice, they did cite that this latest phase of the violence began with October 7th. They also called for the unconditional release of the hostages being held. You know, the debate around it, I think, is whether they were forceful enough about that or not, but it's in there, anybody can read it. However, the simple reason why Hamas is not on trial at the ICJ is because it's not a state. It's not considered a state actor. And this is an important point for Israelis to remember, because we have certain public influential figures saying that, well, Gaza is a state and it should be treated as a state in terms of Israel's the legitimacy of a full-out war with Gaza right now, and all sorts of advocacy for doing terrible things. So Israelis tend to look at this as if the Palestinians are a state, and as if Gaza itself is a state, but the rest of the world does not see Hamas as a state actor, and it's not a party for that reason to the convention of the Genocide Convention or the International Court of Justice. However, I do think there's something unfortunate about the situation, because these are clear legal technical reasons, but for regular people watching this, there's the appearance that Israel alone is being accused. And it's important to point out that there is another court in The Hague, that's the International Criminal Court, in 1998, began operating just over 20 years ago in 2002. And that is where individuals are tried. So just to make, in case anybody's not clear, the ICJ is the older court established in after the Second World War as the main court of the United Nations that exists in order to hear conflicts between states, whereas the International Criminal Court was established, took much longer to establish, took a very long time for the countries to agree on something like a common statute for trying individuals who are accused of the kinds of crimes that we're looking at: war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And that is and more recently, the war of aggression. So that is the forum where we can expect a case to be brought against individuals who would be responsible from Hamas. And of course, Palestinians can also make their case, and there are preliminary investigations already going on in the National Criminal Court. So this is the kind of thing that we could expect to see in the future as the forum for trying individual Hamas members. But we have to keep in mind that one of the concerns about all of these mechanisms of international law, as much as I will say personally, I'm a big supporter of the entire project of trying to create, rules-based international order that is grounded in international law. But one of the many flaws of the system of international courts is that they take a very long time. And so all of these processes, again, there's the technical problem that Hamas can't be tried at the ICJ, which makes it look like a one-sided process. The International Criminal Court can take years and years to hear cases, for the evidence to be gathered and presented and to deliberate. And all of those things take a toll, I think, on the appearance of justice or even the appearance of a fair process. But there are mechanisms for it to happen in the future.
Sheren, I want to go back to you. It's always very problematic to ask what an entire community thinks about anything. And especially in terms of Palestinian citizens of Israel, it's a very diverse community with lots of different kinds of streams within it and different political and cultural characteristics. For instance, one thing that has emerged in polls since October the 7th is a big spike in identification with the Israeli state, with Israeliness amongst Arab citizens of Israel. On the other hand, Arab citizens are coming under quite intensified pressure not to speak out against the war and what is happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. So with all of that, taking all of that into account, what can you tell us about the attitude of Palestinian citizens of Israel about the charge of genocide, bringing the case to the court? And is there some shock at the lack of empathy amongst Jewish Israelis towards what is happening in Gaza, including, as Dahlia just wrote about very recently, an attempt to physically block aid from entering Gaza?
Excellent question, Esther, because Arabs in Israel, Palestinians in Israel right now, they try not to express themselves in public because they're very afraid from arresting, and there is a lot of censorship. And the public discourse about the charge of genocide is not very clear, but from conversation with my friends and some sources, Palestinians of Israel are not really surprised, and some of them, they told me that sooner or later Israel would get there, and maybe the war of Gaza right now highlights the practices of the extreme right-wing government against Palestinians. And I would like to bring you back. We saw what happened in the last March last year in Hawara in the West Bank, when settlers entered the village of Hawara, burned houses and burned cars in response to terror attack that happened before. And these actions didn't happen in vacuum. There was public figures that said that they have revenge should be taken. And in the current war, we see the same pattern of behavior and statements. And I'm talking about the Arabs of Israel, and they're not really talking about genocide, but they're talking more about Nakba. The Palestinians were in 1948, they were displaced from the villages, and some of them never returned. So right now, the war brings all the memories of the war in 1948. And maybe what's happening right now is the first time there is a recognition of the injustice that they have done for Palestinians, and because everything is decumulating, and there's a social media, and we can see and the statements of the member of Knesset. So there's a recognition of the injustice that have done for Palestinians, but all of this situation they have experienced in 1948, and I'm talking about the second and third generation of the Nakba, whose grandparents, grandmothers experienced the displacement. So they're not really surprised, and and another point that the story is not just about the statements of the member of Knesset. It's what really happening on the ground in Gaza. As we see now that Palestinians are displaced from the north to the south, and they are very, very worried that what happened in 1948 will happen right now. And the big question on the table is the Palestinians will be back to the north of Gaza, to their homes, or not? So we saw the innocent people that they're not connected to Hamas, that also displaced, and the pregnant women, elderly people, and all of these stories remind the Palestinians of Israel to the Nakba.
Thank you for that, Sheren. Michael, I want to go back to you. The idea that Israel was about to commit genocide in Gaza, or was intending to do so, started trending on social media almost from October the 8th onwards. Almost from the moment that Israel responded to the Hamas attack. When South Africa submitted its petition to the court, everything was sped up very, very quickly, not least because it had asked for these emergency rulings so that there was a very short time frame for the court to sit in session. Was Israel taken by surprise by South Africa's move? And had the government, Netanyahu's government, actually taken this possibility seriously? And was it ready for it, or did it have to go into some kind of mad scramble to get organized?
So I hope the answer is no. The Prime Minister Netanyahu's government was not expected to do such an act, because if they did expect for this act, why did they talk as they talked, and why did they say that they want to shut down all the electricity and the water supply to Gaza Strip, and goes on and goes on. So I don't really know what was expected by who. I do know from the Israeli hearing that after South Africa applied to the court, Israel tried to negotiate with the South Africans and discussed about the case and about all the details, like a pre-ruling act from the side of Israel, which is very important in the international law and in the ICJ. As Israel said, the South African declined this kind of negotiation and didn't want to discuss about any details from these accusations. About the social media, I must say I'm not an expert. I don't know exactly what happened, what was organically happened, and what was happened by Hamas or Hamas supporters or Hezbollah or Iran. I really don't know. I'm sure that all forces fight in the social media. This is needless to say. The war happened in Gaza, in Israel, and in the social media. Israel act in Gaza and in the social media. Palestinian act in Israel and in social media, and all the forces around the table, and not just around not specifically Israel and the Palestinian, as you said, South Africa, Iran, Lebanon, Qatar, Turkey, and a lot of player in this game. So I don't really have the knowledge to analyze the exact step at the social media. I'm definitely sure that big part of the posts and images and stories that we saw during October 8th and 9th and 10th on social media was organically was very, very humanitarian acts of feelings, and I'm sure that big part of it was induced by big forces and by countries and by a lot of money that put on this kind of war.
Yeah, clearly the war has been an amazing magnet for misinformation, all sorts of campaigns, but there's other kinds of repercussions for that in terms of not just about social media, Dahlia, I wanted to ask you, but about how the fact that the war in Gaza has, shot to the headlines of the entire world for such a long time, and how that has some kind of impact on the ICJ and its deliberations as well. We're not talking about something that has been that is a minority interest. It seems to be an issue that pretty much vast swathes of the world have very, very strong opinions about. I just wanted to quote something from an interview that Netanyahu gave this week with a British conservative journalist called Douglas Murray. And Netanyahu said, nearly all the leaders I talk to say, we know you have to crush Hamas. We know you have a just cause, but we are having problems with public opinion. So please help us out. That was, 100% Netanyahu in every single way you can pass that. But what is the connection between global public opinion and the fact that these charges have been brought against Israel and inside the deliberations of the court itself, the fact that this has become such a major and polarizing issue on the world stage?
Minor question. And I feel like you're raising a huge number of issues there in terms of what can governments do in their foreign policy when they have to cope with the public opinion of their people that might affect their interactions with other states. That's something that actually in the academic literature, there's a name for it. It's called the two-level game, where a leader, like those unnamed global leaders who are telling Netanyahu, oh, we agree that you have to destroy Hamas, but do something for public opinion. That's an example of the two-level game. The leaders talking to each other, but they're both also talking to their publics. And just to remind people that in democracies, people listen to leadership, listen to their publics, and in non-democracies, people listen to the public as well. Public opinion can be even more dangerous, I think, in non-democracies, because the only way for the public to express its anger against the leader is, let's just put it, not through the ballot box. So yes, the leaders of those countries will be, will try to take it into account on some level, but I wouldn't overstate the case. I think that in general, in most Western countries and most Western democratic countries, the rule of thumb is that foreign policy in general tends to be very low on the considerations that most publics think about when they go and vote. And that is sort of a broad generalization of Western democratic countries. Netanyahu may have in mind countries that are not Western democratic countries. I don't know who he's talking about. So I don't, in general, like for other situations, it's not usually the top concern. But as you point out, there is something about this conflict that has driven everybody around the world, frankly, bonkers. Okay, you have people who do not have to live with the consequences, who maybe never thought about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or if they've touched it with it wouldn't be a 10-foot pole, it's like a 4,000-mile pole. People who really don't have any understanding from close up about the situation, who feel that, there's not only the need, but the moral right to decide which direction is the right direction. And so it does seem like there's an incredible global wave going one way or the other. But then to get to your second part about how that affects the justices, this is also, I think, a very tricky question, because it raises a major philosophical issue in law, which is to what extent there can ever be true separation between law and the public opinion, or the law and what we call politics. Of course, it's different when it's the politics of the global situation, but it's still politics. And we've been dealing with this question in Israel, particularly for over a decade now, since I would say the government and the leadership began its first rhetorical and then policy-related assault on the judiciary by accusing it of having become politicized in many ways. So let's just put that out there, that there's never really I think there's never really a hard separation. So if the justices, just to bring it back to the ICJ, if the justices have been influenced by global currents and public opinion, I don't think that is necessarily completely wrong. If courts rule in a way that is totally disconnected from anything to do with the politics of a situation, and they try to rule on a strictly legal basis. That may sound like an ideal, but you have to also imagine that even in the philosophy of law, there's a recognition of the appearance of justice. Well, who decides on the appearance? It's the people who are watching it. Okay, and if a court loses legitimacy and authority, then it's not very meaningful anymore. And let me just also remind people that these international courts, the ICC and the ICJ, maybe particularly the ICC, but they're all facing significant doubts from many other parts of the world, specifically from what we tend to call the global South, but of course it's not limited to the South, the kinds of countries where who find themselves indicted at these courts. And when the courts rule in ways that seem to favor the wealthy countries, or if they don't rule on the more powerful Western leaders, because some of them have simply not joined those courts, particularly the ICC, right? Because the US hasn't joined, Israel hasn't joined. Then you get, severe doubts about the legitimacy of these courts. And so I think that the justices will always take into account on some level, how their rulings will play into the public debate. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but of course they have to balance it with a clear legal reading. So all of those things are probably acting upon the situation here. I'd like to think the justices ruled professionally, but of course it's not surprising that, for example, Justice Aharon Barak, who was appointed as the Israeli representative, dissented, and he did approve 2 of the provisional measures, but he dissented on the major one, that Israel has to prevent actions that could be construed that could be later ruled as genocide, and on some of the plausibility issues. I mean, that doesn't necessarily rate, is that because he's Israeli, or is that because he's really committed entirely to a dry legal reading of the court? And of course, there was a justice from Uganda who dissented as well. Were there politics there? I think it will be hard to know, but I don't think we can expect a pure complete separation of law in any court from the political and social context in which it operates.
Okay, well, that's in some ways a segue to another question that I have for you, Sheren, about what creates the public mood or public opinion, and certainly information and how the mainstream media covers any specific event has a huge role in that. Now, many of you, both now and in the questions that you sent in, have asked about what we can call the information gap between Israelis and the outside world in terms of exposure to what have been pretty brutal images of civilian suffering in Gaza. And the Israeli media, let's accept Haaretz from that for the moment, barely covers that side of the war. On the other hand, in the Arab world media, for instance, Al Jazeera, you also wrote about this towards the beginning of the war, there was very minimalistic coverage of October the 7th, and there's quite a lot of, let's put it kindly, skepticism about Hamas responsibility on that channel now. But in the rest of the world, there is really significant coverage of what is happening in Gaza that you simply don't see on Israeli TV screens. How big and significant is this information gap, and why do you think it's happening? And what kind of effect does that have on how Israelis reacted to the charge of genocide, because they were much less exposed to the pictures of what was actually happening in their name?
Definitely, there is a huge gap between Israel and the rest of the world. We're now living in a bubble, kind of bubble, and the Israeli media, almost all of the Israeli media, there's no reporting on what is happening in Gaza in relation to humanitarian crisis, and the coverage is very one-sided. There's a war, and there's a one side. This is the Israeli side. This is what's happening right now in Israeli media. And as you said, Haaretz is the only newspaper that brings the evidence and facts and the voices of the people in Gaza. But now when the most of Israelis don't know what is happening in Gaza, and they just know that the IDF bombing homes and killing terrorists, and this is what they know. And they don't know anything about the killing of the innocent people, how the war is changing the daily life of Gazan, and what is happening in relation to the collapse of the health system and the education system and other things. So until right now, until now, there's more than 20,000 Gazans that killed, and there's destructions also of the houses. There's severe damage to many areas, but Israeli people, most of them, they're denying these facts, and I think there's a big role of the Israeli media, that there's a reporting of just one side. And I think that we have these numbers, and now Israel have to deal with the ICG, and there's a lot of criticizing what's happening and what Israel doing in Gaza. I think that the Israelis have to stop for some moment and just ask what's happening there in Gaza. You know, it's impossible to continue this situation of denying. The Israeli media are not covering what is happening. It's kind of denying the facts and not reporting for the Israeli people about the facts and what's happening in Gaza. And another point, I think it's not just a lack of knowledge. I think unfortunately, most of the Israelis don't want really to know what is happening in Gaza. After the October 7 events, there's a process of dehumanization of Palestinians in the Israeli society. You know, I'm talking with you in English, and I'm talking for the people here, and I feel very comfortable to speak in English. But when I have to speak in Hebrew, I feel uncomfortable because I know that people will not listen, or there's no, they don't accept the facts. You know, many times when I publish some pieces about Gazan people or about the humanitarian crisis, so I receive emails from Israeli people in Hebrew, and they tell me, they wrote for me, let them die, or there are no innocent people in Gaza and they should die. One of the people who wrote me sent me an email that he stopped feeling empathy toward Gazans, and my articles made him happy. And this is a very weird situation, that when writing about suffering of people on the other side, and some people here in Israel just justify this suffering, and very sad. You know, sometimes I'm asking myself as a journalist why I'm writing and for who I'm writing. And when I talk in Gaza, I think the world attention is there's also a gap between the world attention and the Israeli attention. The whole world is very interested to know what is happening in Gaza, but the Israeli people doesn't matter for him, most of them. And it's very sad for me as a journalist, as a human being, that trying to bring the voices of the people who suffer from the other side.
No, absolutely. And actually, it's what's even more depressing in terms of what will have to come in the day after. Dahlia, you also wrote earlier on in the war about how little Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, according to surveys, have seen of what happened on October the 7th, or credit that many of those events actually happened. So we're really in a dialogue of the deaf and blind here. Michael, I wanted to ask you, one might have thought that one of the explicit lessons of the case, and it's something that you mentioned already, was the role of incitement to genocide and the need to be careful that you're not doing it, because it is one of the key areas to show intent, genocidal intent. It's not really very clear that that message has got through to the public officials, even those who were cited in the court documents, but many others who weren't. For instance, members of the Netanyahu government, including ministers from his own Likud party, were singing and dancing at a conference last weekend calling for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, which is basically, ethnic cleansing and a war crime. Is Israel supplying more material for the case currently at the ICJ, or for subsequent cases at the ICJ or at the ICC, which, as Dahlia said, can charge individuals? And perhaps the most puzzling question for many of our subscribers is, why doesn't Netanyahu shut them up?
So let me answer about it. But first of all, I would just want to say one more word about the question that Sheren just answered about the coverage in Israel of Gaza and the Gaza population. I think a lot of people in Israel, I don't know how many of the international audience are aware for this fact, but a lot of people in Israel looking for a victory picture. This is words that sounds very often in the Israeli studios. And I think that the fact that a lot of the Israeli television channels, and I mainly say television channels because this is something visually that you need to see. You need to see it by your own eyes. The fact that they don't show a lot of pictures, a lot of videos about Gaza Strip, make all the victory question, which is an important question. It's a victory not on the Palestinian. This is victory on Hamas. This is victory on the October 7th war. Make this question very complicated, because if you cannot see what you're doing to the other side, what you do to the other side, what's your act against the other side, you would never be able to tell a story of a victory. And I think that the story of a victory after October 7th is an important story for the Israeli society. I think that the victory of Israel against Hamas, and I'm saying it very clear, it's against Hamas and not against the Palestinian population and not against the Gaza population, but a victory on Hamas. It's a very important victory for the Israeli existing. And I think that this is the point that two answers are going to combine together. You asked about Netanyahu and about the ministers and about the, celebration last week in the convention of the transfer and that we saw last week on the newspaper. I think that Netanyahu still dealing with very, very major political conflicts and political dilemmas about his near future. And from this fact, he cannot define a victory. And because of that fact, he cannot fire his ministers that go and celebrate at the same day that 24, I think, soldiers have been killed. And because of his political interest, he cannot decide about any future deal to release the hostages, or he have a difficulty to decide about these deals. So all those questions combined to the big name of Netanyahu and the big issue of Netanyahu. I think a lot of this is about his political interest, and a lot of this is about his personality and personal interest of Netanyahu. And that's why he is very limited about what he can or cannot say to his ministers. He's very limited about what he can do for any wants of the other members of the coalitions. And this has become a very big problem of Israel, because at the end of the day, all the ministers want to make politics, and all the minister wants to show to their own base and their own public how strong they are, how Zionist they are, how do they feel about all the situation. At the end of the day, we will find ourselves once again in front of the ICC or the ICJ or any other international system of law and the criticism about all the main partners in the world. So at the end of the day, I think that once we go forward about this war, the Israeli interest faced against Netanyahu personal interest, and this is became more and more visually and more sad story.
Yeah, certainly a sad story, something that we're all paying for. Obviously, if it was up to me, we'd carry on for another hour, but I can't keep everyone here to this Zoom. So I'm going to thank all of you, to you, Sheren, Dahlia, and Michael. We're also, for our subscribers, thank you for joining us. Again, a recording of this will be available in a couple of days, so you'll be able to enjoy it again. And we'll be sharing our new community email address in the chat, so you can always reach out and be in touch with us. And thank you again for being a subscriber to Haaretz, because without you, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.